The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Texas plains as 17-year-old Margaret O'Brien stood frozen in her wedding dress, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. The white lace gown her mother had spent months sewing felt like chains around her trembling body. Through the small window of the Frontier Church, she could see her intended husband, Thomas Heartfelt, adjusting his tie with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the SL world. Margaret had known this day would come since she was 14. Her father had arranged the marriage to secure water rights for their struggling ranch, and she had accepted her fate with the quiet resignation expected of frontier daughters. But now, as the moment approached, terror consumed her like wildfire. Thomas was 38 years old, a wealthy rancher known for his quick temper and heavy drinking. The bruises on his previous wife's arms before her mysterious death 2 years ago had not gone unnoticed by the women of Cedar Creek. The sound of approaching footsteps made Margaret's stomach lurch. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her face lined with worry and exhaustion from years of frontier hardship. "Margaret, dear, it's time," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken fears. "Your father is waiting to walk you down the aisle." Margaret turned to face her mother, and for a moment neither woman spoke. They both knew what this marriage meant. It meant survival for the O'Brien family, whose crops had failed for 3 consecutive years. It meant water rights that would save their cattle from dying of thirst. It meant Margaret would become the property of a man who had already buried one wife under questionable circumstances. "Mama," Margaret began, her voice barely audible, "I can't do this. Please don't make me do this." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Child, we've been through this. There's no other way. Thomas has been patient, but his patience is wearing thin. If you don't marry him today, we'll lose everything. Your brothers will have no future. We'll all starve come winter." Margaret looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror hanging on the church wall. Her red hair was pinned up with her grandmother's silver combs, and her green eyes were wide with terror. She looked like a ghost in the white dress, pale and haunted. At 17, she should have been planning a life with someone she loved, perhaps having children who would fill her days with laughter. Instead, she was about to become the wife of a man who made her skin crawl every time he looked at her. The church bells began to ring, their sound echoing across the prairie like a funeral dirge. Margaret could hear the murmur of voices from the main sanctuary where the wedding guests were gathering. Most of Cedar Creek had come to witness the union, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a celebration meal afterward. They would all watch as she walked down the aisle toward her doom, smiling and nodding as if this were the happiest day of her life. Her father appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim but determined. Patrick O'Brien had aged 10 years in the past too, his shoulders bent from the weight of keeping his family alive in an unforgiving land. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of love and desperate necessity. "Margaret, we need to go now. Everyone's waiting." She nodded slowly, feeling as if she were moving through water. Her feet seemed impossibly heavy as she followed her parents toward the main door of the church. The sound of the organ playing the wedding march made her feel sick to her stomach. Through the open doors, she could see Thomas standing at the altar with his back straight and his hands clasped behind him. His black hair was slicked back with pomade, and his expensive suit made him look like a successful businessman rather than the brutal man she knew him to be. The wedding guests turned to watch her entrance, their faces blurring together in her vision. She recognized neighbors, family friends, and business associates of Thomas who had traveled from neighboring towns. Mrs. Peterson from the general store smiled encouragingly, unaware of Margaret's terror. Young Billy Adams, who had been sweet on Margaret since childhood, stood near the back with his hat in his hands and pain in his eyes as Margaret began her slow walk down the aisle. Her mind raced with desperate thoughts of escape. She could run. She could turn around right now and flee through the back door of the church. But where would she go? The nearest town was 40 miles away across dangerous territory. She had no money, no horse, and no survival skills for life alone on the frontier. Her family would be ruined, and Thomas would probably find her anyway. Thomas turned to watch her approach, and the smile on his face made her blood run cold. It was the smile of a man who is about to claim his prize. She had seen that same expression when he looked at his prize cattle or when he discussed business deals that would increase his wealth. She was not a person to him, but a possession, something to be owned and controlled. Halfway down the aisle, Margaret's vision began to blur. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. The faces around her seemed to spin, and she felt as if the walls of the church were closing in on her. Her father's arm tightened around hers, sensing her distress, but his grip only made her feel more trapped. The smell of his cologne, mixed with the scent of flowers and burning candles, made her nauseated. The preacher, Reverend Morrison, stood ready with his prayer book open. He had performed many weddings in his 30 years of ministry, but something about this one troubled him. The bride looked like she might faint, and the groom's eagerness seemed more possessive than loving. Still, he had his duty to perform, and the O'Brien family desperately needed this alliance. Margaret reached the altar on unsteady legs. Thomas stepped forward to take her hand, and his touch made her skin crawl. His fingers were cold and damp, and his grip was firmer than necessary. She looked up into his pale blue eyes and saw no warmth there, only satisfaction and ownership. This was the moment when her childhood ended and her nightmare began. The Reverend began to speak, his words washing over her like waves. She heard fragments about love, honor, and obedience, but they seemed to come from very far away. All she could focus on was the need to run, to escape, to be anywhere but standing in this church about to promise her life away to a man who terrified her. The Reverend's voice droned on about the sacred bonds of marriage, but Margaret could barely hear him over the thundering of her own heartbeat. Her hands trembled so violently that Thomas tightened his grip on them, his fingers digging into her soft skin, hard enough to leave marks. She winced at the pain, and he leaned closer to whisper in her ear, "Steady now, my dear." His voice was low and threatening despite the endearing words. "Everyone's watching. You wouldn't want to embarrass your family, would you?" The threat was clear. Margaret forced herself to breathe slowly and tried to stop shaking, but her body refused to obey. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air, and she felt dizzy from lack of air. The white dress that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt like a burial shroud, and she wondered if this was how condemned prisoners felt walking to the gallows. Behind her, she could hear her mother quietly weeping. The sound broke Margaret's heart because she knew these were not tears of joy, but tears of grief for the daughter she was sacrificing to save the family. Her father stood rigid and silent, his jaw clenched with the effort of controlling his emotions. He loved his daughter dearly, but he also knew that sometimes love meant making impossible choices. "Do you, Margaret Patricia O'Brien, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Reverend Morrison's question cut through her thoughts like a knife. This was the moment of no return. Once she said those two simple words, her fate would be sealed forever. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The church fell silent, except for the sound of shifting bodies and nervous coughs. Thomas's grip on her hands became painful, and she could feel his anger radiating from him like heat from a fire. The guests began to murmur among themselves, wondering what was causing the delay. Double quotes, Margaret began, but her voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Double quotes. Suddenly, the church doors burst open with a tremendous crash that made everyone jump and gasp. A gust of wind swept through the sanctuary, extinguishing several candles and sending flower petals swirling through the air. Standing in the doorway was old Mrs. Whitmore, town's midwife and healer, her gray hair wild and her eyes bright with urgency. "Stop this wedding," she cried out, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "There's been an accident at the Hartwell Ranch. Men are needed immediately." Thomas released Margaret's hands so quickly she almost stumbled. His face darkened with rage at the interruption, but he couldn't ignore a crisis at his own property. "What kind of accident?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the church walls. Mrs. Whitmore was breathing heavily from her run into town. "The river flooded overnight from the storm up north. Your cattle are trapped and the bunkhouse is underwater. 3 of your men are missing, and the rest are fighting to save what they can." The news sent a ripple of shock through the congregation. Everyone knew that Thomas's wealth came from his cattle operation, and a flood could destroy everything. The men in the audience began talking urgently among themselves about organizing a rescue party. Thomas stood frozen for a moment. Torn between claiming his bride and protecting his livelihood, Margaret felt a surge of hope for the first time all morning. This interruption might be the answer to her desperate prayers. But her relief was short-lived when Thomas turned back to her with determination etched on his face. "We'll have to make this quick," he said to Reverend Morrison. "Continue with the ceremony." "But Thomas," the Reverend protested, "perhaps we should postpone." "No postponement." Thomas cut him off sharply. "I've waited long enough for this marriage, and I won't wait any longer. Say the words, Reverend." Margaret's newfound hope crumbled like dust. Even faced with potential financial ruin, Thomas was more concerned with possessing her than with saving his property. The realization of how much he wanted to control her made her more frightened than ever. "Do you?" Margaret Patricia O'Brien, the Reverend, began again reluctantly. "Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health. For richer or poorer, until death do you part." The words hung in the air like a curse. Margaret looked around the church desperately, seeking any escape, any excuse to delay or avoid this moment. Her eyes met those of young Billy Adams, who was watching her with such sadness that she almost started crying. She saw her brothers sitting with their heads down, unable to meet her gaze. She saw the neighbors who had known her since birth, all waiting for her to seal her own doom. "I can't," she whispered. But her voice was so soft that only Thomas heard her. His face twisted with fury, and he leaned down to hiss in her ear. "You will say yes, or I'll make sure your family loses everything anyway. I have enough influence in this county to destroy your father completely. Do you understand me?" Margaret felt something break inside her chest. This was not just a marriage, but a form of slavery. And Thomas was making it clear that he would use her family as weapons against her for the rest of their lives. The hopelessness of her situation crashed over her like a wave, and she felt herself drowning in despair. But as she opened her mouth to speak the words that would condemn her, another commotion erupted outside the church. This time, it was the sound of horses galloping hard and men shouting warnings. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder and closer, until it seemed like a cavalry charge was bearing down on the little church. Indians. Someone screamed from outside. "Comanche war party heading this way?" Panic exploded through the congregation like wildfire. Women screamed and grabbed their children while men reached for weapons they had left at home. The peaceful wedding had suddenly become a scene of terror, as everyone remembered the stories of Comanche raids that had plagued the frontier for decades. Thomas cursed violently and released Margaret's hands to reach for the gun he wore under his jacket. "Get everyone to the back of the church," he ordered Reverend Morrison. "Bar the doors and windows." But before anyone could move, the sound of hoofbeats stopped directly outside the church. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been, and everyone held their breath, waiting for whatever would happen next. Margaret stood frozen at the altar, her wedding dress a stark white beacon in the dim church light. Feeling like she was caught between two different kinds of doom, the church door creaked open slowly. A shadow fell across the threshold. Everyone stared in terrified fascination as a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. It was clear from his stance and clothing that he was indeed a Comanche warrior, but he stood alone and made no threatening gestures. Margaret found herself staring at this unexpected apparition, her fear of Thomas momentarily forgotten in the face of this new development. The warrior's presence changed everything, though she couldn't yet understand how or why. All she knew was that her wedding day had just taken another dramatic turn. Perhaps her fate was not as sealed as she had believed. The Comanche warrior stepped into the church with fluid grace, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. He was tall and powerfully built, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders, and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was painted with red and black stripes, and he wore traditional buckskin clothing adorned with beadwork and feathers. Despite the war paint and weapons he carried, there was something calm and controlled about his presence that was oddly reassuring. The wedding guests pressed against the walls of the church, their faces white with terror. Several women had fainted, and children clung to their mothers' skirts. The men fingered their guns nervously, but didn't dare draw them. Unsure whether this lone warrior was the advance scout of a larger war party or something else entirely, Thomas stepped protectively in front of Margaret, his hand on his pistol. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "If you're here for horses or cattle, we can negotiate. There's no need for violence." The warrior's dark eyes swept over the congregation before settling on Margaret. When he looked at her, she felt a strange shiver run through her body, though she couldn't tell if it was fear or something else. There was an intelligence in his gaze that surprised her, and she found herself unable to look away. "I come in peace," the warrior said in clear English, his accent only slightly marking his words. "I seek the woman in white." His words sent a new wave of panic through the crowd. Everyone knew that Comanche warriors sometimes captured white women to trade or keep as slaves. The idea that this man had come specifically for Margaret made the situation even more terrifying. "You can't have her," Thomas snarled, drawing his gun and pointing it at the warrior's chest. "She's my wife. I'll die before I let you take her." The warrior seemed completely unimpressed by the weapon aimed at him. He took another step forward, and his hand moved casually to the tomahawk hanging from his belt. "She is not your wife," he observed calmly. The ceremony was not completed. Margaret stared at him in amazement. How could he possibly know that? Had he been watching them? The thought that he might have seen her terror and desperation made her face burn with shame, but also gave her a strange feeling of being understood. "The ceremony will be completed," Thomas insisted, his gun hand trembling slightly. "Right now, in fact. Reverend, continue with the wedding." Reverend Morrison looked back and forth between the armed white man and the calm Indian warrior, clearly unsure which posed the greater threat. His hands shook as he held his prayer book. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I don't think this is the time," the Reverend began. But Thomas cut him off with a savage glare. "Now, Reverend, finish the ceremony now." The warrior watched this exchange with interest, his dark eyes missing nothing. When he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that made everyone in the church listen, despite their fear. "The woman does not wish to marry," he stated simply. "I have been watching. She is afraid." Margaret gasped. He had been watching, and he had seen her terror. No one else in the church had seemed to notice her distress, or if they had chosen to ignore it. But this stranger, this enemy, according to everything she had been taught, had seen her desperation and somehow understood it. "That's none of your business," Thomas spat, his anger making him reckless. "Margaret, tell him you want to marry me. Tell him you're here willingly." All eyes turned to Margaret. She felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. Her parents watched her with desperate hope, knowing that their survival depended on this marriage. Thomas glared at her with barely controlled rage, his threat about destroying her family still ringing in her ears. The wedding guests waited to see what she would say, their fear mixing with curiosity, but it was the warrior's steady gaze that held her attention. There was no demand in his eyes, no expectation or threat. He simply waited, as if he already knew what her answer would be and was prepared to accept whatever she decided. Double quotes, Margaret began, then stopped. For the first time in her life, someone was asking her what she truly wanted, and she found herself unable to speak the lie that was expected of her. "She wants to marry me," Thomas answered for her, his voice hard. "Now get out of this church before I put a bullet in you." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. The calmness remained, but underneath it, Margaret sensed a coiled strength that could explode into violence at any moment. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but it carried a threat that made everyone in the church shiver. "I did not ask you," he said to Thomas. "I asked her." The confrontation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Margaret realized that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the lives of everyone in the church. If she said she wanted to marry Thomas, the warrior might leave peacefully, and her sacrifice would save her family. If she told the truth, violence would surely follow, and people might die because of her selfishness. But as she looked at Thomas's face, she saw something that made her decision for her. There was possession in his eyes, and cruelty, and the promise of years of suffering ahead. He had threatened to destroy her family anyway, marriage or no marriage, if she didn't obey him completely. She realized that sacrificing herself wouldn't actually save anyone. It would just give Thomas another weapon to use against them all. "No," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the tense silence. "I don't want to marry him." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Thomas's face went white with rage, and several people gasped in shock. Her mother made a soft crying sound. Her father's shoulders slumped as if he had been physically struck. "You don't know what you're saying?" Thomas said through gritted teeth. "You're overwrought. The presence of this savage has confused you." But Margaret felt clearer than she had all morning. Speaking the truth had lifted a weight from her chest. And for the first time in months, she could breathe freely. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "I don't want to marry you, Thomas Hartwell. I never did." The warrior nodded as if her answer had confirmed something he already knew. He looked at Thomas with those dark, intelligent eyes and spoke words that would change everything. "The woman has spoken her choice," he said calmly. "She will come with me." The church erupted in chaos as the full implications of his words sank in. Margaret was being offered a choice between two different kinds of captivity. But at least one of them was unknown rather than certainly terrible. As the shouting and crying swirled around her, she found herself looking into the warrior's eyes and wondering if she had just made the best decision of her life or the worst. The chaos in the church reached a fever pitch as Thomas raised his gun higher, his face twisted with murderous rage. "You're not taking her anywhere," he snarled at the warrior. "I've paid good money for that girl. She belongs to me." The warrior's expression remained calm, but Margaret saw his hand shift slightly toward his tomahawk. The tension in the air was so thick she could almost taste it, and she realized that blood was about to be spilled in this sacred place because of her decision. "Wait," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt the familiar terror of being the center of attention. But this time, instead of accepting whatever others decided for her, she stepped forward with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "No one has paid for me because I'm not property to be bought and sold," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm a human being. I have the right to choose my own fate." Her words sent a ripple of shock through the congregation. Such bold statements from a young woman were unheard of in their conservative community, and several people gasped at her audacity. Her father looked stricken, knowing that her defiance would bring consequences for the entire family. Thomas turned his gun toward Margaret, at his finger tightening on the trigger. "You ungrateful little witch," he spat. "After everything I've done for your family, this is how you repay me?" I should have known better than to trust a red-headed Irish brat. The sight of the gun pointed at Margaret galvanized the warrior into action. He moved with lightning speed, covering the distance between them in 3 quick strides. His hand clamped down on Thomas's wrist with crushing force, and the gun went off with a deafening bang. The bullet lodging harmlessly in the church ceiling, women screamed and children cried as the two men grappled for control of the weapon. Thomas was strong and desperate, but the warrior was faster and more skilled in combat. Within seconds, it twisted the gun from Thomas's grip and sent him sprawling across the floor. "No harm will come to you," the warrior said to Margaret, his voice steady despite having just been in a life-or-death struggle. He handed Thomas's gun to Reverend Morrison and stepped back, his hands visible and empty. "I give you my word." Margaret stared at him in amazement. In all the stories she had heard about Indian warriors, they were portrayed as bloodthirsty savages who showed no mercy to their enemies. But this man had had the opportunity to kill Thomas and had chosen restraint instead. He had protected her from immediate danger and then stepped away to prove he meant no harm. Thomas struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You think this is over?" he shouted at Margaret. "I'll hunt you down wherever you go. I'll make you pay for this embarrassment, and I'll make your family pay too." The warrior's eyes hardened at the threat. He spoke to Thomas in a voice that was quietly menacing. "You will not follow. You will not harm this woman or her family. If you do, you will answer to me, and I will not show mercy a second time." There was something in his tone that made even Thomas step back. The wealthy rancher was used to intimidating others with his money and connections, but he recognized a more primal kind of danger when he saw it. This man had killed before, would kill again if necessary. Margaret's mother pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret, please," she begged. "Think about what you're doing. This man is a stranger, a savage. At least with Thomas, you'd be among your own people." The words cut Margaret deeply, because she could hear the love and desperation in her mother's voice. Mary O'Brien was terrified for her daughter's safety and heartbroken at the thought of never seeing her again. But she was also thinking about the younger children at home who would suffer if this marriage alliance fell through. "Mama," Margaret said softly, taking her mother's hands in hers. "Thomas just threatened to hurt our family whether I married him or not. He was never going to honor his promises to help us. At least this way, I have a chance at something different." Her father stepped forward. His weathered face creased with anguish. "Daughter, you don't understand what life is like among the Indians? The stories we hear, the stories you hear are told by people who want you to fear us." The warrior interjected quietly. "They serve those who profit from hatred and war. I offer only what I have promised, protection and freedom from harm." Margaret looked around the church one last time, seeing the faces of people who had known her all her life. They were looking at her with confusion, fear, and judgment, unable to understand how she could choose the unknown over the security of staying within their community. But she realized that their idea of security had never included her happiness or safety, only her usefulness to others. "I have to go," she said to her parents, her voice breaking with emotion. "I love you both, and I love my brothers. I can't sacrifice my life to a man who will only bring misery to all of us." The warrior extended his hand to her, palm up, waiting for her decision. Margaret looked at that strong, calloused hand and then at Thomas, who was already plotting his revenge with his supporters. She thought about the bruises on Thomas's first wife's arms and the fear in the woman's eyes before her death. She thought about the years of abuse and control that awaited her if she stayed. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in the warrior's. His fingers closed around hers gently, and she felt a shock of warmth run up her arm. There was strength in his grip, but also careful restraint, as if he was very aware of his own power and determined not to misuse it. "What's your name?" she asked him as they walked toward the door together. "I am called Running Wolf," he replied. "And you are Margaret of the O'Brien clan." She was surprised that he knew her full name and lineage, but then she realized he must have been watching her family for some time to know so much about their situation. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it made her feel less alone. Someone had cared enough to learn about her life and understand her desperation. As they reached the door of the church, Margaret turned back one last time. Her wedding dress, which had felt like a prison that morning, now seemed like a symbol of the life she was leaving behind. Her parents stood holding each other, their faces etched with grief and fear for her future. Her friends and neighbors watched in shocked silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. "I'll find a way to help the family," she called to her parents. "I promise I won't forget you." Running Wolf paused at the threshold, his hand still holding hers. "Your family will not suffer for your choice," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My people have need of trade partners. The O'Brien clan will prosper if they choose honor over fear." With those words, he led Margaret out of the church and into the bright Texas morning. She could hear Thomas ranting behind them, demanding that the men of the town organize a pursuit. But she also heard other voices counseling caution and reminding everyone that the Comanche warrior had shown restraint and mercy as they walked toward his horse. Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling over her like a blanket. She was leaving everything she had ever known to follow a man whose language and customs were foreign to her. She had no idea what awaited her in his world. But for the first time in months, she felt hope stirring in her chest alongside the fear. For the first time since leaving the church, Margaret allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that she might have found not just escape from her old life, but perhaps the beginning of something entirely new and wonderful. 3 months had passed since Margaret's dramatic escape from the church, and autumn was painting the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. She stood outside the teepee that had become her home, watching the daily life of the village unfold around her with a sense of contentment she had never imagined possible. Her hands were busy with beadwork, a skill Evening Star had taught her with patient dedication. The intricate patterns that had once seemed impossibly complex now flowed naturally from her fingers. She took pride in the beauty she was creating. Her hair, which had grown longer and wilder, was adorned with a single eagle feather that Running Wolf had given her the previous week, a mark of honor and acceptance. "Within the tribe, you look happy," Evening Star observed, settling beside her with her own handwork. Over the months, the two women had become closer than sisters, sharing stories, dreams, and the countless small moments that build deep friendship. "I am happy," Margaret replied, and was surprised by how easily the words came. "I never knew life could feel this. ... Free, the transformation had not been without challenges. Learning the language had required constant effort, and understanding the complex social customs of the tribe had taken careful observation and many gentle corrections from Evening Star. There had been moments of homesickness when she wondered about her family, and times when the cultural differences seemed overwhelming, but gradually, Margaret had found her place in this new world. She had proven herself useful by sharing her knowledge of white customs and language, helping the tribe in their trading relationships with frontier settlements. Her skills with horses learned on her family's ranch had earned respect from the warriors. Most importantly, she had discovered talents and interests she never knew she possessed. Running Wolf approached them across the village common, his stride confident and purposeful as always. In the months since bringing Margaret to the village, he had become a different man. The bitter anger that had shadowed him since his wife's death had gradually lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment that everyone noticed. "The traders from San Antonio have arrived," he announced, settling onto the ground beside them. "They are asking specifically for the white woman who speaks both languages. Your reputation as a negotiator has spread, Margaret." Margaret felt a flush of pride at his words. She had discovered a gift for translation that went beyond mere words. She could help both sides understand not just what was being said, but what was meant. Her success in brokering fair trades had brought prosperity to the village and respect for her. "Personally, I'll speak with them after the evening meal," she said. "But first, Evening Star has something important to tell us." Running Wolf looked curiously at his sister, who was trying to suppress a smile. "What news, sister?" Evening Star could contain her excitement no longer. "I have had another dream," she announced. "A good dream this time, full of light and new beginnings." Margaret and Running Wolf exchanged glances. Evening Star's prophetic dreams were always taken seriously by the tribe, and her predictions had proved accurate too many times to be dismissed as mere fantasy. "Tell us," Running Wolf requested, his voice gentle but intent. "I saw Margaret standing in a place of honor, wearing the ceremonial dress of our people," Evening Star began, her eyes bright with joy. "She was surrounded by friends and family from both worlds, white and Comanche, and there was great celebration. Most importantly, I saw love in her future, and children who will bridge the gap between our peoples." Margaret felt her cheeks burn at the mention of love and children. Over the months, she had become increasingly aware of Running Wolf's attention, and she could not deny that her own feelings had grown beyond gratitude into something deeper and more complex. But the memory of Thomas Hartwell's possessive cruelty made her cautious about romantic attachments. "Dreams of the future are not certainties," Running Wolf said carefully. Though his eyes lingered on Margaret's face, "they show what is possible, not what must be." "True," Evening Star agreed. But this dream felt different from the others. It felt like a promise rather than a warning. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young warrior on a lathered horse. He dismounted quickly and ran toward them, his face grave with important news. "Running Wolf," the messenger called out. "Riders approach from the east. White men, armed and traveling fast. They carry the scent of anger and violence. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She had always known this moment might come when someone from her old life would track her down and force her to face the consequences of her choice. Her mind immediately went to Thomas Heartfelt and his threats of revenge. Running Wolf was already standing, his demeanor shifting from peaceful contemplation to warrior alertness. How many riders? How far away? 6 men, perhaps 2 hours behind me, the messenger reported. They stopped in the settlement at Willow Creek asking questions about a white woman living with the Comanche. The settlers tried to discourage them, but they would not be turned away. Margaret rose to her feet, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's Thomas," she said quietly. "He's kept his promise to hunt me down. Then he will learn the cost of breaking his word," Running Wolf said grimly. "I told him he would answer to me if he harmed you or pursued you." "No," Margaret said firmly, surprising both siblings with the strength in her voice. "This is my choice to make. I won't have blood spilled because of my decisions." She had learned much about courage in her months with the tribe. The Comanche respected bravery above almost all other virtues. And Margaret had discovered reserves of strength within herself that she never knew existed. The frightened girl who had stood trembling in the church was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to make her own choices, accept their consequences. "I'll meet with them," she decided, "but not alone, and not as their prisoner. I'll meet them as a member of this tribe with my family beside me." Evening Star squeezed her hand supportively. "We will all stand with you," she promised. "You are our sister now." Within an hour, the entire village was prepared for the confrontation. The warriors had taken defensive positions around the perimeter, but they remained hidden to avoid appearing threatening unless violence was actually initiated. Margaret stood in the center of the village with Running Wolf and Evening Star at her sides. Dressed in her finest Comanche clothing and wearing her hair in the traditional style she had learned, when Thomas Heartfelt and his 5 companions rode into the valley, they found not a cowering captive but a confident woman who belonged exactly where she stood. Thomas himself looked haggard and desperate, his expensive clothes travel-stained and his eyes wild with obsession and rage. "Margaret," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I've come to take you home where you belong." Margaret stepped forward, her head held high and her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "I am home, Thomas Heartfelt. This is where I belong. This is where I choose to stay." The words marked the end of her old life and the beginning of her new one. Whatever happened next, Margaret O'Brien had finally learned to speak her truth and claim her own destiny. The frightened bride who had run from the church was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her courage, her purpose, and her place in the world as the confrontation unfolded in the valley below. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how this chapter of Margaret's story would end and what new adventures might begin. Running Wolf's horse was a magnificent black stallion that stood waiting patiently beside the church. The animal was clearly well-trained and well-cared for. With intricate beadwork decorating his bridle and a colorful blanket across his back, Margaret had grown up around horses, but she had never seen one quite like this, powerful yet graceful. With intelligent eyes that seemed to assess her as carefully as his master had. "His name is Thunder Walker," Running Wolf said. Noticing her admiration, "He has carried me safely through many dangers." He helped Margaret mount the horse, his touch respectful and careful. The white wedding dress spread around her like a cloud, creating a striking contrast against the dark horse and the warrior's traditional clothing. As Running Wolf swung up behind her, Margaret felt the strength of his presence at her back and found it oddly comforting rather than threatening. Behind them, the church had erupted into heated arguments. Thomas was demanding that a posse be formed immediately to pursue them, but other voices urged caution. Sheriff Coleman, a practical man who had dealt with Indian conflicts before, was trying to calm the situation. "Heartfelt, that warrior could have killed you and half the people in that church," the sheriff said firmly. "Instead, he showed restraint and even made promises about trade. Maybe we should consider that the girl made her own choice rather than starting a war over it." But Thomas was beyond reason. His pride in his plans had been shattered in front of the entire community, and his rage demanded satisfaction. "I'm offering $1,000 to any man who brings that girl back, and the Indian's scalp with her," he shouted. Several young men looked tempted by the bounty, but others shook their heads. They had seen Running Wolf move and fight, and they weren't eager to face him in combat, especially not over a woman who had clearly stated she didn't want to marry. Thomas Hartwell. As Thunderwalker carried them away from Cedar Creek, Margaret felt each hoofbeat taking her further from the world she had known all her life. The familiar landscape of her childhood rolled past the struggling farms, the creek where she had played as a child, the hills where she had picked wildflowers with her brothers. She wondered if she would ever see any of it again. "Are you afraid?" Running Wolf asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted. "But I was more afraid in that church than I am now." He nodded, as if her answer made perfect sense to him. Fear of the unknown is natural. Fear of what you know will hurt you is wisdom. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, following game trails and creek beds that would make them difficult to track. Margaret gradually became aware that Running Wolf was an expert horseman, guiding Thunderwalker with subtle shifts in weight and gentle touches rather than harsh commands. The horse seemed to anticipate his wishes, moving smoothly across the rough terrain as they climbed into the hills beyond Cedar Creek. Margaret caught her first glimpse of other riders in the distance. Her heart jumped with alarm until she realized they were moving to intercept any pursuit rather than threatening her. And Running Wolf, she counted at least 6 mounted warriors, positioned at strategic points along their back. "Trail? Your friends?" she asked. "My brothers," Running Wolf replied. "They will ensure we are not followed." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The presence of other warriors made her escape more secure, but it also drove home the reality that she was now completely dependent on these people she didn't know or understand. Everything she had been taught about Indians suggested they were violent and unpredictable. Yet Running Wolf's calm manner and thoughtful words contradicted those stories as the morning wore on. The landscape began to change. The rolling farmland gave way to wilder country, with deeper canyons, rockier hills, and more abundant wildlife. Margaret saw deer grazing in meadows and hawks circling overhead. The air was cleaner here, free from the smoke of cooking fires and the dust of wagon traffic. "Where are we going?" she asked as they paused to rest. Thunderwalker beside a clear stream. Running Wolf helped her down from the horse and gestured toward the distant mountains. "To my village. It is 2 days' ride through country your people do not know. You will be safe there while we decide what comes next." Margaret knelt beside the stream to splash cool water on her face and drink deeply. The wedding dress was already showing signs of the journey, with dust on the hem and small tears from branches they had passed. She realized she had no other clothes with her, no possessions except what she wore. "I have nothing," she said suddenly, the reality of her situation hitting her. "No clothes, no money, no way to take care of myself." Running Wolf studied her face carefully. "You have courage," he said simply. "You chose freedom over safety. That is not nothing." He produced a leather pouch from his saddlebags and offered her strips of dried meat and some kind of flat bread. "My sister makes this," he said. "It will give you strength for the journey ahead." Margaret accepted the food gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten anything since the previous evening. Her stomach had been too twisted with nerves to handle breakfast before the wedding. The meat was seasoned with unfamiliar spices, but tasted better than she had expected, and the bread was filling and nourishing. "Tell me about your sister," she said, curious about the family she might be joining. "What is she like?" Running Wolf's stern expression softened slightly. "Evening Star is 2 years younger than me. She is wise beyond her years and has the gift of seeing into people's hearts. She knew before I did that I would find you." Margaret nearly choked on her food. "She knew? How could she know?" "She had dreams," Running Wolf said matter-of-factly, as if prophetic dreams were perfectly normal. "She saw a woman in white who was trapped like a bird in a cage, and she told me I would need to set the bird free. When I saw you standing in that church, I knew she had seen truly. The idea that a stranger had dreamed about her predicament sent chills down Margaret's spine. She had always been taught that such things were superstition, but something about the way Running Wolf spoke made her believe him. Perhaps there were forces at work in the world that she had never imagined. "Why did you care enough to help me?" she asked. "I'm a stranger to you, and helping me could bring trouble to your people." Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, gazing across the stream toward the mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and sad. 3 winters ago, my people lost many women and children to an attack by white soldiers. They claimed we had raided their settlements, but we had been hunting far from any white towns. The soldiers did not care about truth. It's only about revenge for crimes we did not commit. Margaret felt a chill of horror at his words. She had heard stories of Indian attacks on white settlements, but she had never considered that there might be another side to those tales. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been terrible. Among those killed was my wife, Snowdove. And our young son," Running Wolf continued, his voice steady, but filled with old pain. "I have carried anger in my heart since that day, and it has made me hard and bitter. But when I saw you in that church, trapped and afraid, I remembered what Snowdove used to tell me about the power of compassion to heal wounded spirits." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. This man had lost everything to violence between their peoples, yet he had chosen to help her rather than hate her. She began to understand that her rescue was about more than just her own situation. It was part of Running Wolf's journey to heal his own wounded soul. "She sounds like a wonderful woman," Margaret said gently. "I'm honored that helping me reminds you of her wisdom." They remounted Thunderwalker and continued their journey through increasingly wild country. Margaret found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to. Before the way, the light filtered through the trees, the calls of different birds, the tracks of various animals in the soft earth. Running Wolf pointed out landmarks and told her about the plants and animals they encountered, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of his people. As afternoon faded toward evening, they reached a high plateau that offered a spectacular view of the surrounding country. Margaret could see for miles in every direction, with no sign of human habitation except for a thin line of smoke rising from somewhere deep in the mountains ahead. "My village," Running Wolf said, following her gaze. "We will reach it tomorrow." They made camp in a sheltered grove beside a small spring. Running Wolf gathered wood for a fire while Margaret tried to arrange her wedding dress in a way that would be practical for sleeping outdoors. The silken lace that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt absurd in this wilderness setting. "Here," Running Wolf said, offering her a soft deerskin shirt and leggings. "These belonged to my sister when she was younger. They will be more suitable for travel." Margaret accepted the clothes gratefully, though she felt awkward about changing in front of him. Reading her discomfort, Running Wolf tactfully busied himself with tending the fire and preparing their evening meal while she stepped right behind some bushes to change. The Indian clothing was incredibly comfortable compared to the restrictive wedding dress. The deerskin was soft and well-tanned, and the garments allowed her much greater freedom of movement. When she emerged from behind the bushes, Running Wolf nodded approvingly. "Now, you look like someone who can survive in the wilderness," he said with what might have been a small smile. As they sat by the fire eating their simple meal, Margaret found herself studying Running Wolf's face in the flickering light. Without the war paint, he looked younger and less intimidating. His features were strong and intelligent, and there was a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted everything she had been taught about Indian warriors. "What will happen when we reach your village?" she asked. "What will your people think of you bringing a white woman among them?" Running Wolf considered her question carefully. "Some will be suspicious," he admitted. "Others will be curious. But Evening Star has already spoken to the tribal council about her dreams, and they have agreed to welcome you if you come in peace." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being judged by an entire community of people whose language and customs she didn't understand. But she also felt a growing sense of anticipation. For the first time in her life, she was about to experience something completely new and unknown, free from the expectations and limitations that had always confined her. As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the stars appeared overhead, Margaret wrapped herself in the blanket Running Wolf had given her and settled down to sleep. Despite the strange circumstances and uncertain future, she felt more at peace than she had in months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was finally free to face them on her own terms. Margaret woke at dawn to the sound of bird song and the gentle crackling of a newly built fire. Running Wolf was already awake, was preparing a simple breakfast of the same dried meat and flatbread they had shared the night before. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine and wildflowers that made her feel more alive than she had in months. "Did you sleep well?" Running Wolf asked, as she sat up and stretched muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground. "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Despite being in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, she had slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. The constant anxiety that had plagued her since her engagement to Thomas seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation for whatever lay ahead. After a quick meal, they broke camp and continued their journey deeper into the mountains. The terrain became more challenging as they climbed higher. With narrow paths winding between massive boulders and thick stands of pine trees, Thunderwalker navigated the difficult ground with sure-footed grace, never once stumbling or hesitating. As they rode, Running Wolf began teaching Margaret words in his language. He started with simple things, the names for horse, water, fire, and sky. Margaret found the sounds difficult to pronounce at first, but she was determined to learn. She had always been quick with languages, picking up French from a traveling priest and some Spanish from the Mexican workers who sometimes helped with cattle drives. "Your tongue learns quickly," Running Wolf observed as she successfully repeated a phrase he had taught her. "Evening Star will be pleased. She has been eager to have another woman to talk with who understands the ways of the white world. Has she been to white settlements?" Margaret asked, intrigued by the idea that his sister might have experience with both cultures. "She was taken by soldiers during the same raid where Snowdove was killed," Running Wolf said quietly. "She spent 2 years as a captive in a white household before she was able to escape and return to us. The experience changed her, but also gave her wisdom about how different peoples can live together." Margaret felt a chill at the thought of what Evening Star must have endured. The stories of Indian captives in white settlements were often as brutal as the tales of white captives among the tribes. She began to understand that the cycle of violence and revenge between their peoples had created suffering on both sides. "I'm sorry she went through that," Margaret said softly. "It must have been terrible to be separated from her family and forced to live among strangers." "Yes," Running Wolf agreed. "But she says that understanding came from her suffering. She learned that fear and hatred grow from ignorance, and that healing can only come when people see each other as human beings rather than enemies." As the morning progressed, they began to encounter signs of the Comanche village. Margaret noticed worn paths branching off from the main trail, and occasional markers that Running Wolf pointed out arrangements of stones and sticks that conveyed information to other tribal members. The smoke she had seen the previous day was growing closer and thicker. "We are almost there," Running Wolf announced as they crested a high ridge. Below them spread a valley unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. The Comanche village was nestled beside a clear stream, with perhaps 60 teepees arranged in orderly circles. Horses grazed in large herds in the surrounding meadows, and she could see people moving about their daily activities. What struck her most was how peaceful and prosperous the settlement looked. The teepees were well maintained and decorated with colorful paintings. Gardens flourished near the stream, and children played happily among the lodges. This was nothing like the savage encampment she had been taught to expect. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Meant it sincerely. Running Wolf guided Thunderwalker down the winding path into the valley. As they descended, Margaret became aware that their approach had been noticed. People stopped their activities to watch the unusual sight of their turning warrior accompanied by a white woman in Indian clothing. She felt her stomach flutter with nervousness. Wondering what they thought of her presence, a group of riders came out to meet them. And Margaret's anxiety increased when she saw they were all warriors armed with bows and lances, but their manner seemed more curious than hostile. And they greeted Running Wolf with obvious warmth and respect. The warriors spoke rapidly in their own language, clearly asking questions about Margaret. Running Wolf answered calmly, and she caught a few words she recognized from their language lessons. When he mentioned Evening Star's dreams, several of the warriors nodded with understanding, and their expressions toward Margaret grew more welcoming as they entered the village proper. People emerged from their teepees to get a better look at the visitor. Margaret saw women in beautiful buckskin dresses decorated with intricate beadwork, children with bright, curious eyes, and elderly people whose weathered faces spoke of long lives and accumulated wisdom. Despite her nervousness, she was struck by the sense of community and belonging that seemed to emanate from the group. A young woman broke away from the crowd and ran toward them with obvious excitement. She was perhaps Margaret's age, with long black hair adorned with feathers and shells, and intelligent dark eyes that sparkled with warmth. Margaret knew instinctively that this must be Evening Star, brother. Evening Star called out in English, surprising Margaret with her fluency. "You have brought the woman from my dreams." She reached up to help Margaret down from Thunderwalker, her touch gentle and welcoming. "I am Evening Star, sister to Running Wolf. I have been waiting to meet you." Margaret found herself looking into the face of someone who radiated kindness and wisdom despite her youth. "I'm Margaret O'Brien," she said, then added hesitantly, "Thank you for welcoming me. I know my presence here must be ... unexpected." Evening Star laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Nothing is unexpected when the spirits show it to you in dreams. Come, you must be tired and hungry from your journey. There will be time for formal introductions later. First, you need rest and food." She led Margaret toward a large teepee, decorated with symbols of stars and running wolves. The interior was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with soft furs covering the floor and backrests made of willow and buffalo hide arranged around a central fire pit. Colorful blankets and bags hung from the poles, and the air smelled of sweet grass and sage. "This is our family lodge," Evening Star explained, as they settled onto comfortable cushions. "You will stay here until we can prepare a place of your own. You decide to remain with us." The phrase "if you decide to remain" struck Margaret powerfully. Throughout her entire life, other people had made decisions about where she would live and what she would do. Now, for the first time, she was being offered genuine choice about her future. "What are my options?" she asked, curious about what possibilities might exist in this new world. Evening Star smiled mysteriously. "More than you might think. But first, tell me about your life before yesterday. I want to understand the cage my brother freed you from." As Margaret began to tell her story, she realized she was talking to someone who would truly understand what she had experienced. Evening Star listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions and nodding with recognition at Margaret's descriptions of feeling trapped and powerless outside the teepee. She could hear the normal sounds of village life continuing, children playing, women talking as they worked, men discussing the day's activities. It was remarkably peaceful and domestic, nothing like the dangerous savage camp she had been taught to fear.